Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this study day. We call it a Gidea Park study day. Well, I am in Gidea Park. John is in Newmarket, I think, and Paul, as you know, is in Ilford. So it's wonderful. And I want to say hello to everybody who's out there. I trust there's hundreds of people out there, and if they're not out there now, they're going to be out there as time goes on because this. I was going to say performance, John, but these lectures will be available on the What Good News website probably from about Monday. So one of the things about 2020 in this quite a notorious year, but one of the things in regard to church history is that it's 150 years since the climax of the First Vatican Council, the council which, as you know, solemnly declared the primacy and the infallibility of the Pope, very sort of important Catholic issues. And John is going to take us through the council, the reasons for the council, and what happened at the council. But I think also, very interestingly, what was the reaction to the council? What did the bishops of England and Wales, for example, think about the council? And among them, of course, there is the gigantic figure of John Henry Newman, recently canonized. So we're going to hear what Newman thought about infallibility, whether it was opportune to declare it in this way. So I'm looking forward to this very much, and I won't take any more time. You know John Morrill, Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, Emeritus Professor, also Deacon of the Diocese of East Anglia. So John, welcome back to Gidea Park, as it were, and we welcome you with a round of applause.
Lovely, it's lovely to be with you all, and I'm really sorry it can't be in person as it always has been in the past. I'm going to be talking about some pretty angry men, and it will be men, some pretty angry men and behaving very uncharitably towards one another. And I've got a bit more sympathy with them this morning than I would have had, because I'm very angry this morning because my daughter's moving house on Monday, and the lovely bunch of flowers that I've organised for her to have when she arrives has been delivered this morning, and the house is empty for the next 48 hours. So I'm going to be able to try to empathise with the anger of those who gathered in 1869, in fact, in December 1869, for the council. And it's very important for me as a historian, talking historically, just to not make you feel too despairing about this. So let me talk a little bit more theologically, just by way of preamble. Jesus Christ founded the church to continue his work of building the kingdom of heaven. And he had to rely on some very weak followers, disciples who fell asleep, who quarrelled during the Lord's Supper, who fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, and who ran away and deserted him as he was tortured to death on the cross. And the leader of those men, the person Jesus appointed to be the leader of those men, actually 3 times denied he even knew him or knew who he was. It's interesting that Thomas More, another great English saint, Thomas More, in a long meditation on the Passion, which he wrote when he was expecting his own execution when he was in the Tower, he said that Christ's agony in the garden had nothing to do with fear for himself. It had everything to do with fear for his mission. Could he really rely on these broken men around him to carry on his mission? And of course, on the first Easter day, there were 11 frightened men in an upper room, and that was about it. And now there are 2,000 million Christians. Ever since that first Easter day, the church has been growing, despite, as well as because of, the witness of the followers of Jesus Christ. And in all ages, the church has been composed of people who have tried to build the kingdom in very imperfect ways. So when we look at what happens in 1870, It's a similar. We could talk about the 4th and 5th century, when the great battle in the church was over the nature of the Trinity, when in fact quite a lot of the popes were heretics. They refused to accept the teaching of general councils, and the decision on whether Arius or the supporters of what we see as the Nicene Creed for the Council of Nicaea, it was decided by thugs, by people, bands of armed Christians going around beating one another up, and it turned out that the supporters of the Nicene Creed had better thugs than the supporters of Arius. And we could look at the Reformation in another sorry tale. So this tale of what happens in 1869 to 70 is in some ways a sorry tale, but truth can come out of very unpromising circumstances. God can take almost anything that we offer him and transform it to good, as he does every time we present ourselves for Holy Communion, and he takes what we offer of ourselves and he turns the brokenness of our lives into something of service to him. So let's hold that in mind as we go into this story. So we have our first slide, please, Paul. So the first slide, the Pastor Eternus is the name of the decree which came out of the First Vatican Council and which defined papal infallibility. So that is the document that we will be coming back to in due course. I'll talk before coffee about why Pope Pius IX, or Pio Nono as he was always known, why the Pope wanted a council and why many others didn't want a council, with special emphasis on English reactions. And after the break, I'll talk about the council itself and what happened after it ended. And again, I'll put special emphasis on England and Ireland. Now, the council is special because it was global. It was the first council. There have been more than 20 councils before, but this was the first one which was significantly global, with more than 200 bishops who served in dioceses outside of Europe. And it was attended by 80% of the world's bishops. So it was a big council. It lasted 8 months, was intended to last much longer, and in fact was suspended in July 1670 with the intention of it reconvening, and when the political circumstances changed, and it never did reconvene. So it only, in fact, lasted for those 8 months. So let's look exactly what we're looking at. Go to the next slide, please, Paul. This is a defining paragraph from the Pastor Eternus. And I put in bold the bits I want you particularly to focus on. Therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian faith, for the glory of God our Saviour, the exaltation of the Catholic religion, and the salvation of Christian people, the Sacred Council approving. Notice that word approving, we'll come back to it. Approving, we teach and define that it is a divinely revealed dogma, that the Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in discharge of the office of pastor and teacher of all Christians by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine regarding faith or morals to be held by the universal church, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, is possessed of that infallibility with which the divine Redeemer willed that his church should be endowed, for defining doctrine regarding faith or morals, and that therefore such definitions of the Roman pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the church. The word approving there, the Sacred Council approving, means that it was happy with them, but it didn't actually, the Pope didn't have to accept their advice. The Pope is teaching in his own authority, he's just noting that the council approves of it. And notice that there is an important qualification here. He defines a doctrine regarding faith or morals. It's not, the Pope isn't infallible when he says it's going to rain tomorrow. The Pope isn't infallible when he when he says he's going to excommunicate the King of Italy, but he is infallible in matters of faith and morals. That what constitutes faith and morals, of course, will ultimately be down to him. Well, let's look at some of the sense of the tensions and personality clashes which we're going to encounter. Central, of course, is Saint, remember he is Saint John Henry Newman, a convert from Anglicanism in 1845, creator of the Catholic University in Ireland, founder of the oratory in Birmingham based on the charisms of St. Philip Neri, and a towering figure of intellectual authority and rectitude on what we could call, for the sake of, just for clarity, the liberal side of the church. Now here is John Henry Newman talking about his Archbishop of Westminster, Henry Manning, who was also a convert. And here he is talking about Manning. We are shrinking into ourselves, narrowing the lines of communication, trembling at freedom of thought, and using the language of dismay and despair at the prospect before us. That is Newman on Manning in the lead up to the council. Now Manning, who became a Catholic 6 years after Newman, so he received the church in 1851, a significant year, as we'll see. He was extraordinarily a married man who was widowed in the late 1840s. He'd been an archdeacon in the Church of England. And after becoming a Catholic, he becomes the founder of a community of oblates based on the charism of St. Charles Borromeo. So he's working in central London with the poor and the destitute and the most in need. He becomes a friend of the first Archbishop of Westminster, Nicholas Wiseman, and Wiseman makes him the provost of his pro-cathedral. There isn't yet a Westminster Cathedral, but he's a provost of what constitutes a pro-cathedral. And he is completely unexpectedly, against anybody's expectation, least of all his own, 14 years after he becomes a Catholic, 17 years after he was a happily married man in Chichester, he becomes the Archbishop of Westminster, to the horror of almost all the other bishops. He wasn't on the Turner, he wasn't on the list of names which were sent to Rome. There was a list of names which so irritated the Pope that he said, I'm going to go my own way, I'll choose who I want. I want that nice man Manning. He seems to be a good thing. He's a man of decisive views and he's a great respecter of the papal office. And so extraordinarily in 1865, Manning becomes Archbishop of Westminster, and he's to be there for over 30 years. Or almost 30 years, sorry, almost 30 years. Well, here's Manning on Newman. I see much danger of an English Catholicism of which Newman is the highest type. It's an old Anglican, patristic, literary Oxford tone transplanted into the church. In one word, it's worldly Catholicism, and it will have the worldly on its side, and it will deceive many. And here's another Englishman who is a chamberlain to Pio Nono or Camerlengo to the Pope, Monsignor George Talbot, writing just before the council to Manning. To be Roman is to an Englishman an effort. Dr. Newman is more English than the English. His spirit must be crushed. So that's what's happening at the upper level of the church in the 1860s in England. But if you want to take an international perspective, here is what Bishop Josip, the next slide please, what Bishop Josip Strossmayer has to say about the council. Strossmayer is in the Balkans. He's the Bishop of Bosnia. He's a Croatian. And he is fighting within the Ottoman Empire, within the Muslim Empire, trying to make the case for the survival and strengthening of the Catholic Church. And he watches with dismay this arrogation of power by the Pope, and now he has to try and explain to the Turkish authorities what the implications for them will be of this. And he says of the council, a servile Senate decreed the emperor to be God. Looking back, of course, to the corruptions of the Roman Empire in the days of some of the worst emperors of that first century after Jesus. Now, a key background to what we're going to talk about in the next slide. This even surprised me. I mean, I've been studying history for a long time, but I'd got a very generalized view about the 19th century, about the reunification of countries which have been splintered over the centuries, the reunification of Germany, reunification of Italy. I hadn't realized just how big the papal temporal power was. There you have a map which shows the Papal States as they were before 1860, occupying most of the north of Italy. I mean, it's about a third of the whole of Italy, spreading from Rome in the south to Bologna, Ravenna and Ferrara in the north, via Perugia and Cona. So this huge area that is under direct papal control. Now, as the south and the north of Italy come together to form a new Italian kingdom, the desire of those who are passionate about Italian reunification, they want to reclaim the whole of Italy. And the international powers are called in by the Pope to defend them against this insurgency. But as usual, you know, international powers don't want to spend too much money on this, and at a crucial moment in 1860, the Italians invade the new Italian kingdom invades the Papal States, and most of them are occupied by Italian troops, leaving the Pope only the Rome itself and an area to the north of Rome, which is about a sixth of what it had before. So in the 1860s, the Pope is worried that this will continue to lead to his loss of independence. And he says the temporal power of the Pope was a signal of the freedom, independence, sovereignty of the kingdom of God upon earth. He can't see how the kingdom of God can be truly proclaimed by a Pope who is the prisoner of another kingdom. So the need to protect the independence and autonomy of the papacy, and to give him the authority to act quickly and effectively against those who seek to take away what he thinks of as his divine mandate of having an independent territory of his own from which to rule the church, is a key part of the story that we have to tell. If we go to the next slide, one of the reasons why Pius is so apprehensive is that in the previous half century, popes had actually frequently, during the great international wars, had become prisoners of powerful political interests. So Pius VI had been imprisoned during the period 1797 to 1801. He then made a deal with Napoleon, which we'll come back to. But in 1806, he falls out with Napoleon, and Napoleon puts him under house arrest again, and he remains under house arrest until 1814, when Napoleon is finally overthrown. In 1848 and 49, Pius IX himself, as a newly elected pope, had fled from Rome because it was being occupied by international forces. So and in the 1860s, he only remains in Rome. He only remains in an independent Rome because of French troops. He has French troops who are paid for by the French state, who are protecting him from the demands of the occupation of Rome, of the ancient capital of Italy, by the Italian kingdom. So there is this very real sense of threat, and Pius, who is in some ways a very genial a very popular man. I mean, he likes people, people like him, but he has a short fuse, as we'll see. He has a very short fuse. Under pressure, he becomes quite vicious. But his normal demeanour is one of great charm. He'd been elected Pope precisely for that reason, because he was thought to be a calming influence after things that had gone on before. But in 1848, this experience of having to take refuge down in Naples, or in the Kingdom of Naples, against the occupation of Rome, he never forgets that, and he is, I mean, hypersensitive. So if we move on to another map, this takes us back to look at the very long view, and that just gives you not the most handsome map, but a map of the major religions of Europe around 1600. And what I want to point out there is that how solid the Catholic hold is on southern Europe. It's lost parts of northern Europe to Protestantism, and there are pockets of Protestantism in the west of the German Confederation, obviously in Britain and in Scandinavia. But there had been a major reclaiming of territory after the initial Reformation. For example, it's not widely recognised that Poland had fallen to the Protestants initially and is regained mainly through the efforts of the Jesuits in the late 16th century in Lithuania. And then you've got the great Ottoman Empire expanding over most of the Middle East, and indeed over much of what is now Eastern Europe, over the Balkans, parts of Hungary, the whole of what's now what was Yugoslavia, and so on. So that's just to give a sense that there is still threats to the universality of the Catholic Church, both from the results of the Protestant Reformation and from still the very large presence of the Ottoman Empire and of Turkish Muslim threats to Christianity. Right, if we move on then to the next slide, which I call the long view. I mean, the church is always under pressure. There's always at all times the tension between the church with its mission and, as it were, and a society that is based on values which are hostile, or at any rate difficult to reconcile with Christian values. And in the period we're now talking about, in the first half of the 19th century, the legacies of the Enlightenment are the ones which are of most concern to the popes. The Enlightenment, which was about freedom of the human mind, about human control of knowledge, that everything is not only knowable but increasingly known, is a threat to revealed religion. But there's a political program which goes with the Enlightenment, which has to do with that the rulers have the right to make sure that the assets of their territories are used for general good. And there's an attack on the fact that the church owns just such a large proportion of the property. And that the governments begin to say you own that property if you do it for the ends which are consistent with the ends of Enlightenment. So, for example, monasteries are being closed down all over, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, to make way for education. But education is now controlled by the state, not controlled by the church. And the control of education, which had been a real monopoly for the church through the Middle Ages and through the period of the Reformation, is now under threat, that it should be under secular control, both in Protestant and in Catholic countries. There's an attack on religious orders, which are seen as being hostile to secular claims. A significant number of rulers, for example, in Austria, is perhaps the best example, Joseph II, throws the Jesuits out. The Jesuits are suppressed for a while. And then comes the French Revolution. which is a sort of extreme version of Enlightenment values. And the French Revolution, of course, is famous for the massacres, for the terror, for the execution of the king. Perhaps less, familiar to us is the fact that 2,000 priests are killed, are beheaded or murdered. 5,000 flee, 1,000 of them come to England, in fact, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. And the French Revolution leads in 1793 to the abolition of Christianity. It becomes, as it were, criminal offence to show any manifestation of Christianity. And so extreme is the hostility to organised religion of the French Revolution, except for this worship of the supreme being, this kind of creator God who created the world and then left man in charge of it. So extreme is the French Revolution that it actually abolishes the 7-day week and introduces the 10-day week, so that nobody knows when Sunday is. But there were virtually no priests left in France because of the persecution, and for a while there were no sacraments. Well, along comes Napoleon as the heir of the revolution and as the great general who is conquering the whole of Europe, including Italy, which is why after 1797 the Pope is under Napoleonic control or under French control, so we get the Pope and Napoleon. Napoleon thinks things have gone too far. Napoleon isn't remotely Catholic, but he does sort of think that he wants to harness the forces of Catholic support in his great universal crusade. So he makes a concordat, an agreement with the Pope. That's typical of the way that the church had worked over the previous centuries, to reach an agreement with secular rulers over matters where church and state overlapped. But the concordat with Napoleon is quite extraordinary. It transfers all property that had belonged to the church to the state. The state now owns all churches and is responsible for their maintenance, but the church also, it receives tithes, it receives money for that from the faithful. It is Napoleon and his successors who will appoint all bishops and who will approve, in fact, all parish appointments. And he makes his choice of bishops, including people who have not been validly ordained. There was a period during the French Revolution when there was an ordinal which was introduced, which was clearly not involving valid ordination. Now the Pope has to accept that in order to get the sacraments back, some of those sacraments will be administered by people who are not sacramentally ordained. But it's a deal, but the alternative is no sacraments. The alternative is the people of France will go without communion, without confession, without requiem masses, without baptism. So the fact, and the people who are invalidly ordained will eventually die out and this problem will go away. But in the meantime, you just have to live with reality. And this deal is made. And then to add humiliation, Napoleon then says, separately from that, he says, well, I require you to introduce a feast of Saint Napoleon. And the Pope thinks, who's Saint Napoleon? And Napoleon says, there is a Saint Napoleon, and I want a feast of Saint Napoleon. And the Pope says, well, okay, we'll start. Okay, if that's what you require, and he thinks he won't be around forever, it won't last all that long, and of course, nor does it. And he says, well, I'll think of a right good day for it. Napoleon, no, it's got to be my birthday, said Napoleon. And the Pope thought, well, I hope he wasn't born on the 25th of December. When was it? He said 15th of August, second worst possible day. So for 15 years, wherever the French power was, there wasn't a feast on the 15th of August. The Assumption of Our Lady, it was a feast of Saint Napoleon. That is the kind of thing, the legacies of the French Revolution. What happens if the Church has to deal with the realpolitik, with the reality of power? Coming out of the French Revolution, coming out of the Napoleonic period, you see a great growth of things which the papacy finds great difficulty in accommodating to: liberalism, nationalism, rationalism. And behind those terms, liberalism, nationalism, rationalism, come democracy. democracy becoming an increasingly powerful force, is the church going to accommodate to that? Above all, is the church going to accommodate to democracy in the Papal States in Italy? Because people might want to be part of Italy, not part of the Papal States. So you want to deny democracy. Toleration, a very important principle coming out of the Enlightenment. If Catholic rulers introduce toleration of non-Catholic faiths, what is the church to be? The church is very hostile to the idea of there being religious pluralism. Of course, it seeks toleration itself in Protestant states, but it doesn't want to confer it. It's very reluctant to move down that road. Rationalism, the new forms of learning which are coming in, which include, and this is where Father Adrian gets very excited, new forms of biblical scholarship, new ways of using historical, linguistic understandings in order to understand the way in which the scriptures came to be. But obviously also the new geology, the new discovery of all the fossils which make it almost impossible to believe the world was created in 4004 BC, which is what the church taught and believed. So there are loads of these issues coming up, and the papacy is pushing back against it all through the first half of the 19th century. And it reached a climax in 1864. On the next slide, please, Paul. The next slide, when the papacy decides to have a comprehensive denunciation of all the errors which no Catholic, under anathema, that's say on pain of excommunication, no Catholic can subscribe to. And they include denial of the Trinity. They include lots of errors which no good Catholic would want to dissent from, and which are absolutely central to 1900 years of church's teaching. But it does include those were the modern heresies from the point of view of Pius IX, of democracy, toleration, free speech, the idea of progress itself, and the 80th of the 80 errors listed in the syllabus of errors is that progress itself is something which is to be, that truth is fixed, is permanent, is unchanging. Semper eadem. The truth that the church teaches never changes. And when he issues this syllabus of errors, the world laughs at him. Most of the bishops across Christendom are appalled. Most of them are very, very reluctant to promulgate it or to enforce it in any way at all. And the Pope is absolutely dumbstruck that he has so much dissent within the church as well as dissent outside the church. And within a short time of realizing that he's in this pickle, he decides he'll call a general council in which his own authority will be emphatically proclaimed. And it's certainly in his mind to make the catalogue, or sorry, the syllabus of errors, an infallible teaching. Democracy as an evil. Now, of course, he never does it, but that's in the back of his mind, and certainly in the minds of those who think that he has lost it. Well, let's go to the next slide, which just takes over to look at where the English come into this story. Quite a busy slide, the state of English Catholicism. I mean, down to 1800, of course, English Catholicism was really a tiny persecuted minority. The persecution had eased across the 18th century, though there are still riots and burning down of Catholic buildings in the 1780s. There are about 70,000 Catholics, we think, in 1800, mainly in the north, gathered mainly in the countryside around the great estates of that significant number of great families who'd held the faith since right through the period of persecution. But the French Revolution and the period afterwards leads to a number of transformations. 1,000 French priests flee to England in 1800. Sorry, the 1790s rather, and they bring a great deal of French way of devotion with them, and things like the devotion to the Sacred Heart, which was a distinctively French devotion, it now gets into the English Catholic bloodstream at that point. Many religious houses, which of course have been banned since Henry VIII dissolved them in the 1530s, many religious houses come back to England, and so long as they go into fairly remote parts of the countryside, the English state, which is very sympathetic to the victims of persecution, is willing to allow them to come back. So we get the relocation of religious houses to England, places like Doway, Downside, Ampleforth, Stonyhurst, Ware, Oscott, Zion, Stanbrook. All these are places which had big continental congregations of English exiles, which are now relocated, both male and female religious. So they become a presence, and of course they start opening schools. Catholics there seem to be much more opportunities for Catholic education than there had been, obviously, before this, and other for rather wealthy people sending their kids to be educated abroad. Most important is the huge surge of immigration from Ireland. I mean, throughout English history, people have come from abroad to do all the jobs the English aren't willing to do for themselves. I mean, in more modern times, it was the West Indian population in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, it's the Eastern European population in the 2000s and 2010s. But you can go back. Now, the Irish come flooding from overpopulation in Ireland and very, very, very poor conditions for the children, young children in the poor in Ireland. So that down to the 1840s, there is a steady flow of Irish coming in to build the railways, to build the canals, to do that real heavy, basic jobs. And that's made much worse in the 1840s by the potato famine, when the potato crop fails in Ireland, which was the basis of how people survived by growing potatoes. Now, when a disease got into potatoes and they completely went mush, there is mass starvation in Ireland. Huge numbers emigrate to America, but many more come to England. So what one historian says is in the early 19th century, the Irish immigration is a trickle in the 1790s, a stream from the 1820s, and a flood from the 1840s. All this tends to reinforce the segregation of the Catholic community. I mean, there's still widespread dislike of Catholics, suspicion of Catholics. They're not really English, and if they really are Irish, they're not really English. So there's the Catholic population still feels very embattled down to 1850. Now, in the censuses of the 19th century, every 10 years, in 1821, 40% of those who identify as Catholics also identify as Irish. By 1851, it's 50%, and then the 1851 census is 75%. So the English Catholic Church is essentially is an Irish church. That's very important. But from the 1801 onwards, the actual persecution, the laws were eased. So not only were they not enforced, but they were actually repealed. From 1829 onwards, Catholics were at least equal in rights with the Protestants, even though there was a lot of prejudice. And there was a sort of reluctance by Catholics to integrate. And now it's the Catholics who fear integrating with people who distaste them. And finally, before the break, we go to our last slide. The state of English Catholicism in the period up to the Council of 1870. Now, one of the best historians of English Catholicism in the 19th century has this to say: anyone who delves into Roman Catholic archives will be impressed by the energies with which Catholics devoted to fighting one another. So in 1851, the Rome decides that no longer is England a mission territory like India or Japan. It is now, as it were, somewhere that can be a Catholic, have a real Catholic presence. And so it asks the English government whether it can appoint bishops. And 17 bishops are appointed to given sees, given places where they're based, which do not overlap with the medieval map. In other words, they're new. So Westminster, not London. Liverpool, not Chester, because there's no Anglican Bishop of Liverpool. Leeds, because there's no Anglican Bishop of Leeds, and so on. And so the introduction of the hierarchy means there's now, for the first time, a real official presence and a proper hierarchy in England. There we are. Now, in 1853, sorry, in 1851, there are, no, I'm going to start the other way around. There are 700,000 people identified as baptized Catholics in the census of 1851. And in 1853, when the bishops did their first mass count, it's 253,000. So only 1 in 3 Catholics are actually going to mass in 1850, which makes you wonder whether things aren't quite as bad today as we sometimes think they are. There's a huge drive for vocations. There are 500 priests in the country in 1851. There are 1,000 by 1861. There are 3,000 by 1900. It's important to see that of those between by 1870, something like 450 of the priests are former Anglicans. Manning had his own ordinariate to deal with. Most importantly about Wildman, and particularly Manning, is that they felt it was much more important to build schools than churches. 80% of the money spent on capital expenditure in this period is on schools, not on churches. And Manning made the point, I'm not sure, Wiseman may well have done it already, but Manning certainly made the point he would not lay the foundation stone of his cathedral until every Catholic child had a free education. Extraordinary. That's why Westminster Cathedral was built in the 1890s. Because by then, every Catholic child, every poor Irish Catholic child in England was being given a free education. And that is an impressive story, as since we're going to see the darker side, Manning's radical commitment to the poor, his radical commitment to all those who suffer injustice, has to be seen as central to his vision. And that determination, I will not build my cathedral until every child is being educated in Catholic schools, is extraordinary. So we'll have a break. Oh no, we won't. We've got one more to go. One more to go, Sly. So just finally, just look at the key players, English players, at the Vatican Council we're going to now look at. Dominated by converts, men who'd been brought up and educated as Anglicans. Manning, the Archbishop of Westminster. Newman, the man most revered as a thinker, not only in the Catholic Church, but actually even by those who disagreed with him, respected for his intellect. Across amongst the intelligentsia of England, and W.G. Ward, who is even more extreme than Manning on the importance of papal infallibility. And amongst the bishops who went to Rome, only 3 supported infallibility. Manning, the bishop then, not archbishop then, of Southwark, and another bishop whose name I can't now remember, but there were 3 of them. All the others were what are called inopportunists, and this is the final thing I'll say before we break. Nobody denied the infallibility of the church. nobody denied infallibility of the church, there was great concern about over-defining the nature of that infallibility and how much of it lay in the papal office rather than the church more generally. So the bishops who lead the opposition in England to the infallibility are Bishop Clifford of Clifton, Ullathorne of Birmingham. They are the two most important, I think, and the Bishops of Liverpool, Northampton and Newport, which becomes Cardiff later on. And amongst the really high-profile laymen, W.G. Ward for it, and the great historian, the first Catholic to become a professor at my University of Cambridge, Lord Acton, a professor, Regius Professor of Modern History, Acton as the leading opponent